Today, my mother-in-law wasn't feeling well, so I went to the mansion alone to take care of my tasks. As soon as I arrived, the lady of the house sent me straight to the kitchen. They had guests coming over, and she was adamant that everything must be perfect. She liked my cooking, which is why she put me, along with two or three other workers, in charge of preparing the meal, while assigning others to clean and organize the house. Around midday, the guests arrived, and the lady of the house escorted them to the drawing room. I had finished my work by then and was getting ready to leave for home. As I stepped out of the kitchen, I bumped into someone. When I looked up, I saw it was Shabu, but something was off. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, and there were visible marks on her neck and face. Her eyes were filled with so much fear that I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Her appearance startled me, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Shabu had just come from the little master's room. When I saw her, I froze in shock. Seeing my disbelief, Shabu clasped her hands together and pleaded, "Please don't tell anyone about this. If you do, you'll be in trouble." Just like me. Her words left me both alarmed and confused. I glanced toward the little master's room and saw him standing in the doorway, staring at Shabu with a visibly irritated expression. I was partially hidden behind her, and my face was mostly covered by a veil, so he didn't notice me. After that, I quickly went home. Even after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I'd been working at the mansion for 2 months, and this was the first time I'd witnessed something so unusual. Until now, everything had seemed normal, and I'd never sensed anything out of the ordinary. But today left me shaken. I began to feel that no woman working at that mansion was truly safe. Still, I had no choice but to keep going back. My mother-in-law wouldn't have it any other way. She insisted that if I wanted to live under her roof, I had to earn my meals through hard work. Hearing that, I had no option but to stay silent. Later that night, my husband returned home looking extremely worried. The anxiety on his face made me uneasy as well. When I asked what was wrong, he told me he had borrowed money from the landlord to pay for his mother's medical treatment, and now the landlord was demanding repayment. He didn't have the money, and we could barely afford food, let alone pay off the debt. On top of that, my mother-in-law had insisted I work to help make ends meet. Hearing this, I grew more worried. I wanted to do something, anything, to help my husband get out of the situation. I remembered the small earrings I wore and the nose ring I kept as a simple adornment. I took them off and placed them in his hand, hoping they could help him somehow. But seeing this, he became angry. "These are yours," he scolded. "If I can't provide for you, I have no right to take anything from you." His response made me feel even more helpless. I didn't know what else I could do. I felt trapped between the harsh realities of our financial struggles and the disturbing events I had witnessed at the mansion. Their harsh scolding made me put those items back, but I remained lost in thought. How could I possibly ease my husband's distress? He was my life partner, and seeing him so troubled was unbearable for me. My mind kept spinning as I tried to find a solution, but the weight of his worry clouded my ability to think clearly. In the midst of it all, the strange incident from earlier that day slipped from my thoughts. The mansion was divided into separate areas for men and women, and it was extremely rare for men to wander into the women's quarters. In fact, I had never encountered a man there before. That day, I had been working in the kitchen, completely absorbed in my tasks, when the lady of the house called me into her room. She instructed me to clean her quarters, as none of the other maids' work met her high standards. Whatever I did seemed to be the only thing that pleased her, so she had made me responsible for the cleaning as well. As I worked diligently to tidy up her room, she left, and I thought nothing of it. I had grown used to working in solitude and felt comfortable enough to remove my scarf as I scrubbed and dusted. It had become a habit of mine to work without the scarf when performing longer tasks, something I did out of convenience without giving it much thought. However, I forgot that this wasn't my own home, and it was a mistake that would soon haunt me. While I was engrossed in my work, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I assumed it was the lady of the house returning, so I paid no attention. But then, I felt the heavy weight of someone's gaze on my back, a sensation that made my skin crawl. When I turned around, my heart sank. Standing there was the senior landlord staring at me with an expression that made my blood run cold. His predatory eyes lingered on me, moving from head to toe in a way that was impossible to ignore. Panic gripped me as I quickly tried to cover myself with the scarf, desperate to shield myself from his leering gaze. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my wrist, and in that instant, my fear reached a boiling point. My face turned pale as terror took over, and I felt completely trapped. Just then, the lady of the house returned. The landlord immediately released my hand and stepped back. I struggled to steady my breathing and resumed cleaning the room, trying to pretend as if nothing had happened. Thankfully, he left soon after, and I felt a rush of relief, but the fear lingered. Even after the incident, my husband's worry continued to weigh heavily on me. Day by day, his anxiety grew, and his face became more drawn and weary. Each time I saw him in this state, it only added to my own distress. I wanted desperately to help him, but I had no idea how. He owned no property or land that he could sell to repay the debt to the landlord. That day, I had gone to work alone. By evening, my husband arrived to pick me up. As we walked home, the landlord passed by, and I noticed him glancing at us. His eyes seemed to linger on me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Even at home, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze. I didn't want to burden my husband with this knowledge, knowing it would only deepen his worries. The next morning, when I woke up, my husband shared an alarming message. The landlord had summoned both of us to his estate that evening, claiming he had something important to discuss. Hearing this made my husband's face go pale. He knew all too well what the landlord's intentions might be. I, too, could sense from his earlier looks that this wasn't just a routine meeting. I begged my husband not to take me there. "Tell him I'm feeling unwell," I pleaded. But my husband shook his head. "You don't understand," he said. "If we refuse his order, he'll become furious, and the consequences will be even worse. He may punish me, or worse, he might force you to go regardless." The thought of returning to that man's estate made my stomach churn. His glances, his behavior, and now this summons, it all felt too threatening. My husband's words made it clear that our options were limited. Refusing the landlord's order could lead to severe repercussions. Yet, agreeing to go filled me with dread. The uncertainty of what awaited us that evening hung over me like a dark cloud, making it impossible to think of anything else. I spent the entire day consumed by worry, uncertain about what was going to happen. I hadn't gone to the mansion that day. My heart just wasn't in it. My mother-in-law asked me to accompany her, and when I refused, she left while muttering complaints under her breath. By evening, my fear had taken over completely. My body started trembling and my face grew pale. As darkness spread across the night, one of the landlord's workers came again to summon us. We had no choice but to go. My husband and I followed him to the landlord's estate, each step heavy with apprehension. My husband was in terrible shape. He was visibly distressed. I too felt frightened, but I tried my best to suppress my emotions. I was angry at his cowardice. He was a man, yet he seemed so terrified of the landlord, unable to stand up for himself or speak up for his rights. As a woman, what could I possibly do? Despite my frustration, we kept walking until we reached the estate. The servant led us straight to a room. There, the landlord stood waiting. He looked me over with an intense gaze and then turned to my husband, demanding repayment of the debt. My husband stammered that he didn't have the money yet, but would return it as soon as possible. The landlord stared at him meaningfully, his expression dark and calculating, and said, "I can forgive your debt. You'll never have to worry about paying me back again, but you must do one small thing for me." His words left me stunned, and I saw beads of sweat forming on my husband's forehead. The next thing the landlord said made my blood run cold, as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That day, I'd stayed home, busy with household chores, when my future mother-in-law arrived. As always, she greeted me warmly, her voice filled with affection. She spent quite some time sitting with my mother, whispering in hushed tones. After she left, my mother seemed deeply worried. When I asked her why, she brushed off my concerns, saying it was nothing. But later, as I overheard her talking to my father, I realized what was troubling her. My future mother-in-law had brought up the topic of marriage. My parents didn't have the financial means to cover the costs at the moment. They couldn't afford the dowry that was typically expected. The mention of my marriage had thrown them into a state of anxiety, but the very next day, their worries were eased. My future husband told them he didn't want a dowry. He wasn't interested in anything material. He assured them that he would earn his way and take full responsibility for his wife. Hearing this made my parents immensely relieved. They felt they'd found a wonderful son-in-law. His words also stirred a soft spot in my heart, filling me with affection and gratitude. Soon after, our simple, humble wedding took place, and I entered my new life as his wife. The day after the wedding, I woke up to my first morning in the village as a married woman. Life suddenly felt beautiful, and I was still lost in the sweet moments of the previous night when my mother-in-law's voice startled me. She addressed me with a certain sharpness, saying, "How long do you plan to stay locked up in your room? When will you stop acting like a bride and start doing some work? There's so much that needs to be done in the house. And besides, you're coming with me to the mansion." Her abrupt change in tone left me bewildered. Just yesterday, she'd been so kind and gentle, speaking to me with warmth. But now that I was living in her home, her attitude had shifted completely. Her sudden coldness caught me off guard. Fighting back tears, I rose from my bed and prepared myself. After breakfast, she took me to the mansion. She led me to the mistress of the house, who regarded me with a curious, almost incredulous gaze. "Where on earth did you find such a beautiful girl?" she asked my mother-in-law, her tone one of genuine astonishment. When the mistress of the mansion praised me, my mother-in-law silently seethed with annoyance. Outwardly, however, she smiled and explained, "She's a distant relative of ours and was engaged to my son since childhood. It's a love marriage." Despite her words, I could sense her irritation. After that, she assigned me more work at the mansion. I felt a pang of frustration but kept it to myself. By the time I returned home that evening, I was completely exhausted. I couldn't help but think about the way I was treated, how they took the liberty to put me to work on the very first day of my marriage. The next day, my parents came to visit me. They immediately noticed my drawn, tired face and became concerned. "Are you all right?" my mother asked gently. Before I could answer, my mother-in-law intervened. She dismissed my mother's concern and promptly sent me off to make tea. My mother, clearly worried, wanted to take me back home for a short stay, but my mother-in-law refused. "She just arrived here. If she starts running back to her parents' house so soon, she'll never settle in here," she said firmly. Disappointed, my mother had no choice but to leave. That evening, when my husband returned, he noticed my downcast expression right away. He asked what was wrong, and I couldn't hold back any longer. I told him everything. His face darkened as he listened. He was deeply upset, especially about how my mother-in-law had stopped my parents from taking me home. "Being married doesn't mean she's severed her ties with her family," he told her firmly. His words won my heart, and I felt deeply grateful to him. The very next day, my husband took me to see my parents. My parents were overjoyed to see us and delighted by his kind gesture. I stayed with my mother for 2 days before returning to my in-laws' house. Upon my return, I found my mother-in-law in an even worse mood. She was furious that my husband had taken me to my parents' house, despite her clear objections. In her mind, I had somehow won by convincing him, even though I hadn't said a word to him about it. I tried hard to pacify her, explaining that my husband had acted on his own decision, not because of anything I'd said. It took some effort, but eventually her mood improved. Despite my husband's repeated objections, my mother-in-law continued taking me to the mansion. In that regard, my husband seemed powerless to stop her. Over time, I got to know some of the other women who worked there. Their whispered accounts painted a grim picture of the feudal lords who ruled over this area. The lords had reputations for preying on the daughters of the poor, ruining their lives, and facing no consequences. The more I heard, the more fearful I became. I couldn't help but imagine the worst. What if one of those lords noticed me? What if they decided to target me? It was a thought that made my blood run cold. I knew I wasn't just an ordinary woman. My appearance had always drawn attention. People often stopped in their tracks when they saw me, unable to look away. My fears turned into reality the day I finally came face to face with the senior landlord. It was as if all the fears I had harbored now stood before me in flesh and blood. He stared at me with a look that made my skin crawl, his intent unmistakable. And then, he said something that made my heart stop. He told my husband, "If you want me to forgive your debt, then leave your wife here tonight. I'll never ask you for that money again." My husband's anger exploded. He lunged at the landlord, shouting in fury, but his men intervened. They grabbed him and dragged him out of the room. I watched helplessly as they took him away. My body felt frozen, numb from the shock and fear of what was unfolding. I didn't know what to do or where to turn. Before I could think of a way to escape, the landlord closed the door behind him. He moved toward me, pulling me toward the bed. I was powerless to resist, and in that moment, my world shattered. After that night, I felt I could never face anyone again. I was broken, lost. Under the cover of darkness, I somehow managed to leave that horrible place. I walked through the night, numb and disoriented, until I finally reached home. It felt like the longest journey of my life. Each step I took was filled with fear and despair, my thoughts a tangled web of humiliation and helplessness. When I finally arrived home, I realized that the woman who had left earlier that evening was no more. I had returned to someone else, someone whose life had been irreparably changed. The darkness didn't scare me anymore. At this point, what was left to fear? The most valuable thing I had was already taken from me. When I returned home, defeated and broken, I found the front door ajar. In the middle of the courtyard sat my husband, his head cradled in his hands. Beside him was my mother-in-law. As soon as she saw me, she began to hurl curses my way. My husband, however, quickly got to his feet and rushed toward me, gripping my arms tightly. "What happened to you?" he demanded. "Did the landlord hurt you?" But I couldn't answer him. I silently walked past him into our room, shutting the door behind me. The torn collar of his shirt and the bruises on his face told their own story. He, too, had been through a lot. When I turned on the light and he caught a full glimpse of me, he closed his eyes in pain. I couldn't hide the marks the landlord had left on my neck and body. My clothes were ripped in several places, each tear a testament to the horrors I had endured. Seeing me like that broke something in him, and he began sobbing uncontrollably. His tears and cries of helplessness filled the room. "I'm nothing but a coward," he choked out. "If I weren't so powerless, no one would dare lay a hand on you." Watching him weep like that made me forget my own pain for a moment. I focused on consoling him, trying to bring him back from the depths of despair. But it was clear that he could not bring himself to face the outside world anymore. He refused to leave the house. The few times he did venture out, the villagers taunted him, adding insult to injury. It wasn't long before the whole village seemed to know what had happened. Everyone whispered about it. The landlord had destroyed the lives of many women before, but none of those tragedies became public spectacles. With me, it was different. I had become a walking reminder of humiliation, and I could no longer show my face to anyone. My mother-in-law was the only one who continued to leave the house. She endured the stares and questions from others, and when she returned, she would vent all her frustration on me. She poured her bitterness into my ears, blaming me for everything. She made it clear that she believed I had ruined her son's life. "I married my precious son to this curse," she would say. "I destroyed his happiness by bringing her into this house." Her accusations were relentless, her words dripping with venom. I could never understand why she hated me so much. I had done nothing wrong. None of what happened was my fault. If anyone was to blame, it was her son who lacked the courage to stand up for himself and for me. Or perhaps it was the villagers who remained silent in the face of the landlord's tyranny. One evening, it seemed like an ordinary day. As the sun began to set, a servant from the landlord arrived at our house once again. He told me that I was to go with him. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law turned her face away, showing no reaction. My husband, on the other hand, froze. He looked at the servant in silent disbelief before lowering his gaze, saying nothing. His silence cut me deeply. He didn't even protest. It was as if it didn't matter to him that I was about to be taken back into that same nightmare. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to say no, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Even if I resisted, the landlord's men would drag me away. Refusal would only make my humiliation worse, and the whole village would see me as nothing more than a pawn in the landlord's game. Feeling utterly defeated, I took slow, reluctant steps and followed the servant. The servant left me in the landlord's room and quickly departed. The landlord sat with a bottle of liquor in hand, drinking glass after glass until he was thoroughly intoxicated. His movements became sluggish, his eyes glassy with drunkenness. At that moment, strange sounds echoed from outside, loud, startling noises that immediately caught my attention. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The commotion outside grew louder until I saw something I never expected. My husband suddenly appeared in the doorway, an axe gripped tightly in his hands. Without hesitation, he charged into the room and swung the axe at the landlord. The first blow struck with such force that the landlord fell to the ground instantly. But my husband didn't stop there. He kept attacking, his strikes relentless, his fury uncontainable. Even after the landlord lay motionless, my husband continued to rain down blow after blow. I stood rooted to the spot, too stunned to speak or move. It was as if I had turned to stone, unable to process what was happening before my eyes. It wasn't until my husband grabbed me by the arm that I snapped out of my stupor. He didn't say a word. He simply dragged me out of that dreadful room and led me home. Once there, he left me and walked straight to the police, surrendering himself. The villagers finally found freedom from the landlord's tyranny. But my husband had taken matters into his own hands. He had exacted revenge for all the indignities we suffered and was now willing to face the ultimate punishment for his actions. After my husband was taken into custody, I felt as if my soul had been drained. I no longer laughed, spoke, or even had the desire to eat. My parents, seeing the lifeless shell I'd become, brought me back to their home. They tried everything they could to bring me back to life, to help me heal, but nothing worked. I couldn't escape the memories of the love I had shared with my husband, nor could I forget the terrible injustice the landlord had inflicted upon me. Those moments of torment, those fleeting memories of love, were etched into my very being. My husband's love had taken root deep within my soul. I could no longer separate myself from it, no matter how hard I tried. My family wanted me to divorce him and start a new life, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not even in death would I have been able to sever that bond. I couldn't imagine a life where I turned my back on the man who had loved me so fiercely, so completely. He had acted not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under the landlord's cruelty. In the end, my husband's punishment wasn't as severe as we had feared. He was sentenced to just 10 years in prison. The landlord's crimes, so long ignored, had finally come to light. Case after case emerged, each one detailing the atrocities he had committed against the innocent and the helpless. The villagers, long silent, finally found their voices. They rallied together and demanded justice, not just for themselves, but for my husband as well. They argued that my husband should be pardoned because he had done what no one else dared to do. He had freed the village from a tyrant's grasp. Eventually, the authorities reviewed his case and his sentence was reduced. Now, all I could do was wait. I held on to the hope that my husband would return to me. His release would mean that we could finally rebuild our lives piece by piece without fear or shame. And so I remained waiting for the day he would come home.